The human walked up, the ground crunching with a cold stiffness under his weight as he added a pile of wood to the dimming fire. A puff of ash floated on the air, and dormant coals sputtered to life at the disruption, glowing red-hot. Catet couldn't seem to stop her slight shivering, even with the slight warmth of the fire. Fanning her neck feathers out with a grumble, she took 2 waddling steps closer to the small glowing flames and felt her eyes burn at the closeness. But she was finally beginning to feel its warmth. It radiated into her feathers and past the barrier of down, soaking into the skin. Her crown lifted slightly in content, a bit of iridescent purple catching the light of the flickering flames. The human gave a grunt of a chuckle before settling down next to her. He set his makeshift hatchet on the ground, leaning it against a rock next to him before folding his legs in the same weird fashion that he always does, a position that she wholeheartedly thought looked painful to this day. But he had assured her just as wholeheartedly that it was perfectly comfortable. She figured he only continued to sit in such a way just to annoy her. He braced his arms behind himself and leaned back a bit before taking a deep breath and letting it out in a rush. Well, that should be enough wood for now. Should last till morning. I know the spot's not ideal, but it should do for a single night, he said as he looked down to his companion. She continued to soak up the warmth, her eyes closed in content as she spoke. We shall see how it turns out. It's a bit too exposed for me since we only have this single wall behind us, she said as she gestured with her right wing slightly, pointing with the ends of her primary feathers to the massive wall of rock behind her before she swiftly returned it to her side. It was much too cold to be sacrificing core body heat like that. The human seemed to think for a moment before looking down at her. She was resting her entire body on the ground, her talons tucked beneath her. He couldn't help a slight smile at the position. She looked like a puffed-up hummingbird in the late summer. A roundish ball of green and white fluff, but she seemed a bit too close to the fire this time, too eager to soak up the flames, and that concerned him. All the while, she was completely oblivious to his stare as she continued sitting in her blissful state of warmth. He watched for a few more seconds before speaking up with what had been on his mind for a while now. It's getting too cold for you, isn't it? All her crown feathers lifted up in one swift movement as she finally turned her head to meet his eyes, looking up at his face. She seemed to tighten her wings to her side a little more before looking down at the dirt, the crown feathers slowly falling back into place. Yes, she admitted quietly. He frowned at that. To him, it only seemed somewhere in the 50s. It was cold, yes, but it would get much colder. To him, this was nothing. Growing up in the Midwest trains the body very quickly to adapt to the colder months of the year. He had asked her at some point if her world experienced seasonal changes in temperature. She had said that of course it did. There were cyclic periods of warm and cold on her planet much like any others. Thinking about it now, he should have asked specifically what temperatures she could tolerate. He had just assumed that her insulating feathers could handle it. She had seemed unbothered by it until now. That was definitely an oversight. How much colder will it get exactly? She asked slowly, looking out of the corner of her eye at him. The human shifted out of his reclined position, leaning forward and resting his weight on his forearms by bracing them against his knees. Leaning a bit closer now, he could see the worry in her eyes. He furrowed his brow at her. It's about to get a lot colder, Cat. I don't exactly have a thermometer on me or anything, but if I had to guess, I'd say it gets down to about 255 degrees Kelvin in the middle of the cold season. The human suddenly flinched as Catet jumped to her feet and faced him with her wings half spread. What? She blurted, her eyes wide as her crown feathers flew open in a sharp spring. They almost looked like daggers, they were so sharply pointed on either side of her head. Did you say 255 degrees Kelvin? That cannot be possible. That's well below freezing, she hissed, the blue in her frills slowly puffing out around her neck as she continued to speak in a rush. You can't possibly be serious about such a number. You must be mistaken. There's no way in a world with life on it, even death world life, that could tolerate such... She was cut off as a sudden chilly breeze swept through the little clearing and whipped its freezing current right through her. She seemed to do a weird twitch as her whole body shook. Her eyes were so wide in shock that the human thought she might just freeze up right then and there. She seemed to do a weird twitch as her whole body shook. Her eyes were so wide in shock that the human thought she might just freeze up right then and there. All the feathers that had sprung to life in her anger were suddenly pressed firmly and tightly to her body as she sunk to the ground in a defeated, shivering slump. All the feathers that had sprung to life in her anger were suddenly pressed firmly and tightly to her body as she sunk to the ground in a defeated, shivering slump. However, to the universe, this scene was not pitiful enough, so a second breeze came through, stiffer than the last, and snuffed out the fire that had just begun to gain its strength. A small, audible puff of smoke was all that was left of the once comforting flames. Catet whined, a sound that the human was sure he had never heard from her before, and buried her head in the dirt, her shaking wings coming to cover over her head. The human was just so shocked by the turn of events that for a moment he just sat there, completely wide-eyed and slack-jawed. The air was still for a single moment, as if waiting for a pin to drop. The effect shattered instantly as the human snapped himself out of his shocked state and started laughing so hard the Aryan could feel his shaking even through the ground. He laughed loudly as he pointed at her weakly. You should have seen your face. That was something straight out of Looney Tunes. He was holding his stomach, trying to catch his breath. His sides ached and his eyes started to water. She tried to calm her shivering as much as she could, before lifting her head out of her feathered canopy at the human's sudden explosion of laughter. Her frill of blue was immediately puffed up as it flickered sharply in the fading light. Her eyes were a mix of blazing fire and ice as he continued laughing. The human laughed a couple of seconds longer before getting a hold of himself. He breathed in and out loudly, clutching his sides. She had never seen him breathe so heavily before. But of course, laughing at her expense was enough to get him this riled up. He unlatched his arms from his sides as he finally opened his eyes. He was met with her shivering, pitiful form again, but this time with a show of angry feathers to go along with it. He instantly had to hold back a powerful urge to start another round of laughter all over again at the sight. He barely managed to contain it. Barely. Cat, I'm not gonna lie, that was probably the funniest shit I've seen in a long, long time, he said, his breathing still slightly labored as he wiped a stray tear from the corner of his eye. Catette's feathers somehow flashed an even sharper blue at that, and her eyes seemed to flicker with matching ice. The effect didn't last long, however, as another chilly breeze, just a spider, lightly brushed her form and caused her shivering to increase tenfold. All her anger was once again sucked away from her into thin air. The universe really was cruel, Catette whimpered in her mind as she ducked her head beneath her wings again. The humor faded from his face as he watched her form begin shivering all over again, just from that little breeze. Well, damn, now he felt kinda bad. Oh man, I'm sorry. He tried apologizing, but she gave no response. Her form continued to shake and shiver as if she hadn't heard him. He sighed inwardly. He wasn't sure at first how to apologize to her properly, but then thought better of it altogether. He gripped the outer lapels of his jacket and proceeded to take it off. He couldn't help a bit of a shiver himself, but he knew that if he got the fire going again, and lay down in his temporary moss-padded bedding with his blanket, he would be just fine. Besides, she was definitely going to need this more than him tonight. He gathered the jacket in his arms and slowly leaned forward before gently laying the soft inside part over her arching wings and back. It was so big on top of her that most of it piled up on her sides. She instantly flinched and lifted her head above the spanning feathers at the contact, her feathered crown ready to spring in annoyance should the human try anything else tonight. But to her surprise, he only seemed to be draping something over her. Her two major crown feathers began to lift slowly as she looked down at the cloth. She was confused at first, but soon she began to realize it was a very familiar shade of brown. Looking up, she noticed the human leaning over her, almost looming, which made her heart pick up in nervousness at the unexpected closeness, before his hands let go of the tan-colored jacket. Right away, she noticed that the jacket was still slightly warm from his body heat, and she couldn't help but snuggle a bit further into its weight. It was quite a piece of heavy cloth, too, as its weight was quite a presence over her, but she didn't mind at all. It was warm and it blocked out the bristling wind. It was certainly good enough for her. For a moment, she completely forgot about how she was supposed to be angry with him as her crown feathers fanned out automatically in happiness. The warmth was definitely welcome, even if it came from an annoying human companion. The human simply smiled and watched her for a second, before returning his gaze to the snuffed-out fire. He reached for a smaller, makeshift steel blade, and the chunk of flint still left in the dirt, and proceeded to try sparking the flames to life again. He ended up having to make some tinder to get the larger pieces to light, but soon enough the flames came to life again, much to both of their satisfaction. He added another couple of bigger pieces to the fire once it got going, to make sure the wind didn't blow it out again. There, hopefully that'll stay lit this time, he said before taking his seat back in his spot. He grabbed a longer stick nearby and began poking at the fire absently a few times, trying to give Catette some space for a moment. She watched him tend to the fire for a bit. After she warmed up some, she began to wonder why he had given her his jacket. He had clearly taken amusement at her expense, but if the now reserved presence he made was anything to go by, he seemed to regret it now. Any lingering anger she had felt towards him faded away as she looked back down to the tan-colored garment. He seemed to be waiting for her to say something, for her to make the first move. She angled herself slightly at him, burying herself a bit deeper into the clothing. "You are insufferable sometimes, but all is forgiven," she said quietly. His eyes widened a bit, but he eventually smiled back with a slight chuckle. He continued poking at the fire. As she watched, she took notice of his exposed forearms and wondered if he would be all right without his preferred article of clothing. To her eyes, he seemed unbothered by the chilly air, but she honestly wasn't sure. Trying to catch his attention, she shifted a bit beneath the jacket. A slight ruffling sound could be heard as she adjusted her wings back to her sides. His eyes jumped to her at the movement. She stuck her neck out a bit above the clothing to get a better view of him. "Are you sure you don't need your jacket?" she asked sincerely. He nodded his head. Yep, don't worry about it. I'll be fine. It's not too cold for me yet. I'll need it back at some point down the line, but for now, I think you'll need it more than me, he said as he poked the flaming logs with the stick twice. Cadet nodded back. If the human was fine with it, then she was fine with it. The human seemed to think for a second before meeting her eyes again. Once we get back to the base, though, I think we should come up with something for you to wear. I've got some scraps of clothing left I'm sure we can put together for you. Cadet cocked her head. She wasn't sure what to think about that, but the memory of the chilly breeze from earlier sprung to mind and gave her a good guess as to what it could mean. She didn't like it one bit. So, you were being truthful about the coming cold, she said with a bit of hesitance. The human watched her for a moment, his face quite serious. She shrunk a little at his expression. The human could be quite unnerving with such intense eye contact. It was like something dangerous was lurking beneath them. She knew, of course, that at this point she really had nothing to worry about from him. But instincts were hard to ignore. Regardless, she made sure to stifle her inner unease and listen. Yes, Cadet, in the coming weeks it's going to get very, very cold. We will most likely be stuck at base for some time. That's why we're making a beeline straight there. We need to start prepping. Cadet dropped her chin down, resting it on the backside of her wings. Her neck feathers puffed out as much as they could in a pout. I'm beginning to dislike this planet much more now. How could it possibly get that cold? She asked, looking up at him with shining eyes. The human shrugged his massive shoulders, shaking his head. It's just what it is, I don't know what to tell you. Cadet groaned at that. This planet is crazy. I used to like the season back home too. It only ever got down to 280K at most, and even then, most areas stay inside during that time. Only 280K? Do you live near the equator or something? She looked at him before shaking her head. No, I live near the Highlands. It's located at the southern half of the planet. You mustn't forget, human, that my planet does not have such extremes as yours does. It is unheard of that sentient life can exist in such hostile environments. That is why we call it a death world. And I suppose I shouldn't forget that I'm stranded on one, she said distastefully. I guess I'm just having a hard time trying to imagine a world that doesn't contain such extremes. To me, it's only natural. He trailed off a bit. So you're familiar with these temperatures? It gets this cold on your birth world as well? Well, yes, he said, obviously, angling his body towards her a bit more. In fact, it can get even colder than that in major regions of the planet, not just at the poles. He paused for a moment, gauging her reaction. She looked just as surprised as earlier. At least she didn't leap into the air this time. Where I grew up was a place called Upper Michigan. He said that word in his own language. It was such a strange sound that his voice reverberated in her chest. It used to get so cold that sometimes I would be buried in my house due to I don't know the word. He eyed her for a minute, trying to explain, gesturing with his hands. It is frozen water crystals that fall from the sky. What is that called in common? Cadet only blinked at that. She had no idea what he was talking about. I don't know what that is, and I'm pretty sure I don't want to find out. Your planet sounds just as terrifying as it always does. The human chuckled. You're always so dramatic. She puffed her neck feathers at the statement and wanted to snark back something in return, but he didn't allow her the satisfaction of interjecting. He shrugged his shoulders before leaning back a bit. I guess it's not that much of a big deal, but trust me, you'll find out soon enough what I'm talking about. He finished with a smirk. Cadet shrunk at his statement, feathers flattening. She did not like the sound of that, and she definitely did not like that kind of smirk either. And cursed the human for looking so smug about it. She decided not to comment on it, lest she say or do something humorous once more in the human's eyes and start the whole thing over again. For a few moments the two were quiet after that, as they relaxed after a long day of walking. Blessed flames were finally roaring from the fire now, casting the two companions in an orange and yellow glow. The human looked above their heads for a moment and noticed a darkening sky. Some of the stars were peeking out behind the swaying canopy. The human looked over to Cadet and noticed her eyes looked a bit heavy already. She had walked quite a bit today, further than normal. He had a feeling she was pushing herself for him, and he could swear he'd seen a bit of guilt in her eyes whenever he had offered help. He was trying to be respectful of her independence, but he had to be honest with himself. Ket was, well, she was fragile. Every time she mentioned something about the planet's deathwood-like qualities was just another nail in the coffin to the fact. And even now, with another revelation about her vulnerability to the cold, he couldn't deny that he was worried about her. He sighed a bit. Lots to think about. Another glance at Cadet and he had noticed that she had closed her eyes, her head slightly bobbing. He reached over and poked at her side a bit, trying to wake her up. She did a bit of a jolt before turning her head, eyes blinking rapidly. What? Come on, Ket, it's bedtime. You first, you're about to fall asleep on your feet. He leaned forward into a crouch, waving her over to the slight outcropping in the cliff. The nice moss-padded bed was up against the edge, allowing a bit of overhead cover for the two. Catette's crown feathers lifted a bit at the pleasant sight, and the idea of sleep was indeed an amazing idea. But as soon as she took her first step, the movement of the jacket exposed an opening to the chilly air, and a good portion of the insulated heat was whisked away. Her neck puffed up, and she immediately stilled. The human looked a bit impatient at her stillness, and gestured again at the bed. "What's the hold-up? Come on, I'm kinda tired too, you know." Cadet continued to stare at him, waiting. The human blinked, confused for a moment, before watching as Cadet stubbornly remained in place, giving him an expectant look. The human sighed before reaching over to her, picking her up gently with the jacket wrapped around her. She was about the size of a large eagle. It was the arrangement they had decided to make since traveling. Should anything go bump in the night, the human had thought it best to be on the exposed side of any temporary shelter so he could act quickly. Cadet had no trouble agreeing with such logic. After being placed back down, Catet's crown lifted in joy, showing a flicker of purple. She wasn't sure at first if the human would do it, but she was most certainly pleased by the unexpected outcome. "Geez, you're such a little kid," the human grumbled to himself as he settled himself down beside her. Purple instantly changed to a sharp blue in a quick angular shift of feathers. "I am not a hatchling," she yelled, and dared to flick a feathered wing out of the jacket to slap his arm. It was cold for sure, but well worth it. "Hey, stop that!" he exclaimed, pulling his arm in close to himself reflexively. "No, besides, this is payback from earlier." She whacked him 2 more times before folding her wing back into place and pulling the jacket back over herself. She knew he was only technically humoring her, since she could never really hurt him. But his slight grumbling was all she really needed to hear to be satisfied. The human gave her the stink eye. "Now he was really insufferable," he mumbled. "You still are," she replied easily. The human groaned in such a way that she could feel her chest rumble with it being this close to him. Ignoring her, he reached behind himself and grabbed at the blanket, flinging it out with one swift jerk of his arms. It was unfortunately only big enough for him, but she was content to use his jacket now. "Alrighty, Miss Know-It-All, try to get some sleep. We've got another big day ahead of us tomorrow," he said before closing his eyes and tugging the blanket up to his neck. She looked up at him from inside her cocoon and adjusted herself. She couldn't help a quiet sigh at the words. She was pushing herself more than she ever had, but she wasn't sure how much more she could go. These past couple of days would have been some of the wildest and most exhausting days of her life. Crash landing in an unknown planet, in an unknown solar system, somehow managing to survive such an event, and even meeting a human of all things. And now she was traveling with him. They had a rocky start, with her being completely terrified of him in the beginning, but as the days went by, she was becoming more and more comfortable with his presence. And the longer she stuck with him, the clearer it became that she wouldn't have lasted long on her own out there. Maybe a day or two before something, probably some predator, snatched her up. A grim thought, but most likely a truthful one. In the beginning, her terror blinded her from seeing that, but now it was perfectly clear that he was only trying to help. He actually went very much out of his way to do it too. She could tell. He had slowed down considerably after the first day. He seemed to be trying to accommodate her slower progress, even offering to help when something seemed a bit too challenging for her. She couldn't help but shy away a bit from those moments. A bit of inadequacy had been brewing within her ever since the day they met, and it seemed with every passing day it only grew stronger. After all, how could she possibly keep up with a Death Worlder, and how much longer could she attempt to try? Closing her eyes, she finally rested her head on the mossy, cushioned ground. She would just have to prove herself wrong.